Why Socrates feared the power of democracy. The first hum of an idea is not the loudest part of a revolution. It usually travels as a whisper through a crowded agora, and then, in the breath of a single vote, it can become a roar. Imagine a city where every citizen speaks and every word has weight, where the road to truth is paved by public argument. Now imagine that city suddenly discovering that the crowd's courage can become a weapon more precise than a spear. The power to decide who lives, who speaks, who is remembered. Socrates walked into that paradox with no weapon but questions. What if I told you that Socrates, the master of questioning, did not fear ignorance so much as the mass's appetite to certify its own ignorance as virtue? It sounds odd because democracy is often sold as the purest form of equality. But Socrates lived in a democracy that could, with the same hands that held the olive branch, scribble a verdict of doom on a person's head. He did not fear being outvoted. He feared the ease with which a community could mistake its own fervor for wisdom, its anger for justice. In the Athenian polis, the crowd did not gather to hear the softest truth. They gathered to be persuaded, to be moved, to feel themselves righteous in a moment of collective action. The jury, chosen by lot, was supposed to be a shield for the city against tyranny of rulers. But Socrates saw a creeping tyranny in the other direction. The tyranny of the many when they mistake consensus for virtue and certainty for knowledge. He did not avoid the jury because he feared death. He avoided the trap of believing that popularity equates with right. If the soul's health is to be tended by public opinion, what happens when the doctor becomes the disease? The fear was not fear of the crowd per se, but fear of a democracy that could mistake its own energy for enlightenment, and then mistake that energy for truth itself. It is a subtle misreading. Democracy as a protean force that can liberate and also corrupt, can illuminate and can intoxicate. Consider the moment when a city gathers to decide the fate of a man who asks if the city's comfort is more important than the city's truth. Socrates spoke in a language the city could hear but often could not endure. Questions that do not end in a pat answer. Questions that require a citizen to resist the easy comfort of certain. He knew that the democratic ritual can sanctify courage, but it can also sanctify conformity if it is not tempered by a quiet reverence for truth. To fear the power of democracy is not to fear the people, but to fear the possibility that the people can be seduced into loving their own certainty more than the vulnerable. Messy search for understanding. Socrates did not pretend to despise the crowd. He believed the crowd could be wiser than any single mind, if only it remained open to challenge. If only it kept the door cracked for dissent. His fear was that the door could be slammed shut by the momentum of approval, by the exultation of the majority, by the comfort of a verdict that feels like justice but is merely the absence of doubt. The trial of Socrates becomes a cautionary tale about rhetoric without restraint, about persuasion without accountability. Democracy, in its best form, is a microphone for ideas. In its worst, it is a spotlight that can burn away nuance, turning complexity into comfort and disagreement into danger. Socrates was a guardian of the space between belief and certainty, a custodian of the silence that should precede any claim of truth and the labor that follows. He did not want wisdom to be only a collective mood. A mood can change with the wind. Wisdom, to survive, must endure the long, patient ragtime of doubt. If democracy is a choir, Socrates wanted to hear the counterpoints to the faint notes that remind the chorus that the melody does not equal the meaning. Without such counterpoint, the chorus can become a chant, and the chant a verdict, and the verdict a grave. Yet there is a deeper twist in this fear. Socrates discerned that democracy is more powerful when it is not merely a system of elections, but a discipline of argument. It asks citizens to test their beliefs, to argue with rigor, to tolerate discomfort, and to revise. In other words, democracy is a furnace for refining what a people claim to know. But a furnace can braze a shield or a hedge. It can produce a blade or a wall. The risk Socrates warned about was that the furnace would burn hot enough to forge consensus into certainty, and certainty into dogma, and dogma into a sentence that the very power that gives a city the right to judge its rulers can also seduce it into judging the truth itself as a threat to its comfort. Socrates chose a method that would not allow the crowd to claim innocence. He asked not what is popular, but what is just. He pressed, not to humiliate, but to illuminate. And when he spoke, the city heard him as a challenger, not a companion. He feared not being killed for telling a harsh truth, but for becoming the truth's silent ally when truth must plead with an audience that prefers ease to clarity. If you replace a single word in his situation, the logic remains. A democracy can host the bravest inquiry and the fiercest conformity in the same breath. The power to assemble, to convict, to praise, these are tools, not moral stamps. They require guardians, not merely participants. Socrates saw himself as a guardian of the space between opinion and obligation, a stance that makes a democracy more dangerous to misread than any tyrant. This is not an anti-democracy sermon. It is a recognition that freedom without responsibility is a form of power without conscience. Socrates feared the power of democracy because the power to decide can become the power to end the possibility of disagreement. And with disagreement goes the very possibility of growth. If a city cannot stomach a question that unsettles it, then the city is choosing certainty over wisdom, and certainty, like any short-lived flame, will eventually burn itself out. The turning point in his life did not come with a single argument that changed a mind. It came with the realization that argument itself is democracy's antidote to tyranny. And the antidote requires the courage to hear a counterargument, to adjust, to retreat from a smug posture of knowing. Socrates did not fear the crowd only because they could condemn him. He feared the crowd because they could, in time, forget how to listen, how to question, how to remain vulnerable before truth. He taught that the real power of democracy lies not in the verdicts it hands down, but in the forums it preserves for listening, for challenge, for revision. If you want to measure a democracy's health, you do not watch the speed of its punishments, but the endurance of its humility. Do we still invite contradiction? Do we still honor a dissenting voice as a necessary element of collective wisdom? Socrates would have asked us to answer with careful breath, not with a shout. Resolution/message. The fear he carried was not personal. It was a warning about a republic that forgets the sacred duty to examine itself. He understood that the democracy his city worshipped would eventually demand that every idea earn the right to be said aloud, and every life earn the right to be judged by the truth, not by reputation. He knew that truth's defense cannot be outsourced to the majority's passion or the minority's fear. It must be fought for, patiently, in the open, under the cold light of reason. So what does that mean for us? Living in a time when crowds are louder and algorithms can amplify their volume? It means we carry a version of Socrates inside us, a quiet insistence that power, even democratic power, must be tethered to ethical inquiry. It means asking not just what the crowd wants, but what the truth requires. It means choosing the hard path of doubt when the easy path is to celebrate certainty. It means recognizing that the strength of democracy is not in its capacity to produce unanimity, but in its stubborn insistence that even disagreement deserves a fair hearing. Ultra. If Socrates walked the streets of our time, would he fear the power of democracy or trust the slow, stubborn work of collective reasoning? The question remains, and that is precisely the point. The health of a people is defined by how bravely it can endure its own questions. And in that endurance, perhaps we discover a democracy worthy of its name, not a chorus that repeats itself, but a chorus that learns to listen. What would you be willing to defend when the crowd demands certainty? What questions would you keep alive when the room grows loud with agreement? The power of democracy, if it is to stay humane, must always be tempered by